to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a real intellectual detective story, and it takes us straight to the beating heart of German idealism. We're going to unpack a profound mystery between two absolute giants of Western thought. So here's our central mystery. How exactly did the brilliant poet Friedrich Holderlin and his idea of an unbridgeable tragic loss become the absolute engine for G.W.F. Hegel's massive, all-encompassing philosophical system? I mean, it sounds like a complete clash, right? Poetry up against rigorous logic. But as you'll see, it's actually the master key to understanding one of the most complex philosophical architectures ever built.
All right, Section 1, the subject-object divide and the massive problem inherited from Kant and Fichte.
To really get why Holderlin and Hegel were so driven, we have to look at the massive problem left right on their doorstep. It was this painful, totally unresolved split. On one side, you have the thinking subject. That's our inner consciousness, our mind. And on the other, the objective world, the reality outside of us. You see, Kant and Fichte had essentially locked human consciousness inside its own subjective structures. This dualism acted as a literal tragic gap. It seemingly alienated us from true fundamental reality. Sure, we could know how the world appeared to us, but we had no idea what it was in itself. And this wasn't just some abstract academic puzzle for these guys. It was a deep existential mystery, a profound sense of alienation that they desperately needed to solve.
Moving on to part 2. Holderlin's primordial ground and the lost unity of Seyn.
So, the poet Friedrich Holderlin steps up with a brilliant concept to bridge this painful gap. He called it Seyn, or being, which he posited as an original pre-reflective unity that exists way before any split between subject and object ever happens. But here's where it gets really cool. We can actually just look at the German language itself to reveal his deepest insight into why we lost that unity. Take the German word for judgment, Urteil. This is the act of thinking, right? Making a logical proposition. But Holderlin breaks this word apart into its literal etymological roots, Urteiling, which translates to primordial division. He argued that the very act of thinking, of judging the world, is quite literally a primordial division that severs us from that original unity of being. The crazy part, just to think about the world is to instantly separate yourself from it. So for Holderlin, because thinking inherently is dividing, this rich original unity of Seyn is just forever lost to our conscious reflection. It becomes this inaccessible horizon. We can intuit it, we can definitely feel it in art, and we can write incredibly beautiful tragic poetry about how much we long for it. But the second we try to actually grasp it with our logical minds, boom, we divide it again. For him, it's the ultimate tragic loss of an original divine life.
Which brings us to part 3, Hegel's absolute knowing and the destination of the phenomenology.
Enter Hegel. Now, he looks at Holderlin's profound, tragic gap, but he absolutely refuses to just leave it as a tragedy. He completely flips the script by taking Holderlin's lost, inaccessible origin and turning it into a necessary destination. He transforms that pre-reflective Seyn into what he calls mediated immediacy. What does that mean? Well, it means that absolute unity isn't something we just lost at the starting line. It's something we have to achieve, but only after going through what Hegel vividly calls the pathway of despair. That's the brutal labor of history, alienation, and conceptual struggle. Spirit, or human consciousness, has to go out into the world, really suffer the division, and then return to itself by internalizing all that history through recollection or Erinnerung. The unity isn't pure and untouched, it's hard-won and entirely mediated by our experience. And this perfectly captures Hegel's ultimate stance. He famously wrote, "The true is the whole." It is essentially a result. Truth isn't just sitting there, hiding in some lost mythical beginning. No way. It is one at the very end. At the stage of absolute knowing, that abstract separation between the knowing subject and the truth of the world is finally completely overcome. Being becomes a full possession of the ego. The gap is bridged, not by jumping backward, but by pushing all the way forward.
Let's turn to part 4, the start of the logic and pure being as an empty illusion.
Now, Hegel isn't quite done with the concept of being. In stark contrast to Holderlin's incredibly rich, divine origin, Hegel kicks off his masterwork, the science of logic, exactly like this: being, pure being, without any further determination. He essentially weaponizes the concept of pure being here. He's saying, okay, if we strip away all division, all subject-object relations, all specific thoughts, and try to just start with pure, unadulterated Seyn, well, let's see what that actually looks like in practice. Well, When you actually isolate pure being, you just get an indeterminate immediate. It has absolutely zero qualities, no features, no predicates. Because it is so completely poor in determinations, it's utterly empty. It's just the abstraction of relation to self. And think about it. If a concept is utterly empty and lacks any feature whatsoever, it instantly collapses. It reveals itself to be logically identical to nothing. It's an absolute conceptual trap. Hegel proves that starting with a pure, undivided origin gives you exactly that, nothing.
And that brings us to part 5, closing the philosophical circle and transposing the gap into being. So here is the grand resolution to our intellectual mystery. Hegel didn't just casually disagree with his old friend Holderlin. He took that tragic gap, that deeply painful division between the subject and being, and he transposed it directly into being itself. Just look at the comparison here. For Holderlin, the nature of being is this incredibly rich origin we can never access, which makes our division from it a tragic loss. But for Hegel, being starts out completely empty and meaningless, and only becomes rich at the very end as a mediated result. So Hegel views division not as some tragic mistake, but as an absolute immanent necessity. That negative relation, that literal splitting apart, is the exact necessary motor by which empty being actually develops into the concrete totality of spirit. What this does is build a wildly dynamic, self-justifying circular system. You start at step 1 with pure being, which, as we now know, is practically nothing. Then you move through step 2, which is the immense, grueling labor of history, conflict, and conceptual mediation. Finally, you reach step 3, the absolute idea. But here is the absolute genius part. The absolute idea at the end loops all the way back to explain the beginning. The whole system is a continuous loop. The end literally re-enters the beginning. Which leads us to this massive realization, the vanishing of the semblance of pure immediacy. Hegel shows us that the whole idea of a pure, unmediated starting point, some perfect, undivided origin, was ultimately just an unsustainable illusion. That so-called unprejudiced starting point was secretly always the result of spirit's own self-mediation. Basically, the gap was always meant to be there, entirely so we could have the journey of bridging it. I want to wrap up this explainer by leaving you with a really provocative thought. If Hegel is right about all this, and the very act of division, our struggle, our analysis, our historical separation from nature and being, is the exact mechanism that ultimately creates our profound unity, are we ever truly alienated in the first place? Or is feeling lost really just the very first necessary step of being found? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.